Robby, what's on your radar?
Black Lives Matter. It was more than just a hashtag, of course. It was an entire movement for racial equality, criminal justice reform, and police accountability. It was also a cultural moment and a serious moneymaker. The Black Lives Matter organization raised some $90 million in 2020 alone. That year, of course, was a banner year for racial justice protests. The summer of 2020 saw the death of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police. In response, millions of people all over the world participated in Black Lives Matter activism. That cause wasn't and still isn't necessarily partisan. Even Republican Senator Mitt Romney marched.
We need a voice against racism. We need many voices against racism and against brutality. We need to stand up and say that Black Lives Matter.
$90 million. That's what the national organization raised thanks to all that marching. It's an impressive total, but according to multiple media reports, 2/3 of it, $60 million, remain unspent. What was spent and how it was spent also raised serious questions. Then there's the biggest mystery of all. Who is currently in charge of Black Lives Matter? No one, it seems, has any idea. The Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation is, as far as anyone can tell, leaderless. The founders are no longer involved, and the people they supposedly installed to succeed them never actually took the job. Now, that's all according to a series of bombshell reports in both left and right media. They should give anyone who is considering donating to BLM serious pause. Listeners with good memories will recall that last year, BLM co-founder Patrisse Cullors came under fire for purchasing several million-dollar homes at the exact time the George Floyd protests were underway. In a statement, BLM said that all of this was on the up and up. Patrisse Cullors is the executive director of Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, BLM-GNF. She serves in this role in a volunteer capacity, does not receive a salary or benefits. She has received a total of $120,000 since the organization's inception in 2013 for duties such as serving as spokesperson and engaging in political education work. She did not receive any compensation after 2019. That's a quote from BLM. Now, that very well might be the case. She has many sources of income, book deals, speaking gigs, a media production arrangement. She's a celebrity activist, and that lifestyle can pay. Nevertheless, after the fallout from the story, Cullors resigned as president of BLM-GNF. In May 2021, she announced that her successors would be Makani Themba, chief strategist at Higher Ground Change Strategies and former executive director of the Praxis Project, and Munifa Bendel, chief operating officer at Time's Up Foundation. But just a few months ago, in September, Themba and Bendel released a curious statement. Neither of them had ever assumed the role. They had not been able to, quote, come to an agreement with the acting leadership council of BLM and had ultimately declined the position. In a subsequent tweet, Themba clarified that she was never onboarded, did not ever have access to BLM's funds, and was generally clueless about how the money was spent. According to the Washington Examiner, the remaining board members of BLM-GNF are Shaloma Bowers and Raymond Howard. Bowers, quote, served as the treasurer for multiple activist organizations run by Cullors, including BLM PAC and a Los Angeles-based jail reform group that paid her $20,000 a month and dropped nearly $26,000 for meetings at a luxury Malibu beach resort in 2019. So according to additional reporting from New York Magazine, in 2019, while working on an ultimately successful ballot initiative, Reform LA Jails collected $1.4 million in contribution. More than half was paid out to just 4 recipients. The group sent more than $270,000 to Bowers' company, as well as $211,000 to Aisha Bendel, a friend of Cullors who co-wrote her memoir. $205,000 went to a company Cullors operates with her spouse, Janaya and Patrisse Consulting, and about $86,000 was paid to Trap Heels LLC, an entertainment clothing and consulting company started by Damon Turner, the father of Patrisse Cullors' child. End quote. That's all from New York Magazine. According to fundraising ethicists consulted by both the Examiner and New York Magazine, this is all extremely shady. This is grossly irregular and improper for a nonprofit with $60 million in its coffers, said Paul Kamenar of the National Legal and Policy Center. Charity Watch Executive Director Lori Styron described BLM as a, quote, giant ghost ship full of treasure drifting in the night with no captain, no discernible crew, and no clear direction. These stories were fascinating and really not good. You know, I remember when Patrice came under fire for the houses, and it wasn't totally clear whether it was a hit job. You know, it's making it sound like this is hypocrisy because she's a Marxist, socialist, communist, Leninist, whatever, and she's supposed to own fancy mansions. You know, this is something they went after Bernie Sanders for. It's kind of that vein. And then there was some question, well, how does she pay for these? But she could have used, she's making money as a speaker and book deals, et cetera. So there's nothing necessary to suggest it came out of BLM's vault. But the rest of it now looks pretty. There's no one in charge, or we don't know who's in charge of this organization. It looks like people well connected to the founders were steered money for luxuries, and the people they tried to replace them with never. That's very weird for them to have tried to come on board, and then they probably got like a cursory look at the finances and said, nope, there's going to be criminal investigations here.
Or what responsibilities and what role they'd have. Like, were they being brought in just as kind of figureheads, but they weren't going to have access to the keys to actually run the organization. That happens sometimes too.
It's kind of weird to take in $90 million in 1 year over all this. This is post George Floyd activity, and then just sit on the vast majority of it, to not use like the vast majority of this money for anything.
Right, and you've got a whole bunch of different things going on here. And one, and this goes back to the very beginning of the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, when you had people on the ground, grassroots activists, and then particularly people who were directly impacted, whose children or other family were killed by police. So and then people who were out in the streets. So that's one group of people. Then you have another group of people who were kind of the social media stars, the ones who were channeling that energy that was building on the ground and funneling up into the national conversation on Twitter, on Facebook, with the Black Lives Matter hashtag. And that's really what Black Lives Matter was from the beginning, through an Alicia Garza and Patrisse Cullors hashtags, Black Lives Matter. That really kind of launches it as a brand into the public consciousness, which instantly created a lot of skepticism among a lot of the grassroots activists who were saying, well, what's your role here? Like, attention is good, but how is that helping us down here on the ground? You then had a number of mothers coming forward, Tamir Rice's mother and some others, saying, we're not seeing any of
They're
this.
not seeing a dime.
Like nothing
right, the
from
skepticism
this. Mike
seems
Brown's
very
father.
The skepticism seems very warranted if you read these stories, which interview the New York Magazine story interviews activists who have not those kinds of people, parents of slain black people, the very kind of people this group is supposed to be representing, who have not seen any money or gotten institutional support for the kind of rallies they want to do. The New York Magazine story opens with this great anecdote of someone trying to organize a counter-protest when there's an actual Nazi protest going on, and he gets no support from Patrisse.
Right. And part of this goes back structurally to the complete smashing of the civil rights movement through deindustrialization, through the drug war, and through active police intervention. Famously the FBI trying to get MLK to commit suicide, killing Fred Hampton, that, and you magnify that across the entire country. By the 80s and 90s, you have the civil rights movement destroyed, and so there is no infrastructure then in place to then kind of funnel the energy that's then created in the 2000s, which then answers your question about. So now you have $90 million in kind of foundation money and small dollar money from people who are galvanized, but there's no infrastructure because it's been smashed. And so people are trying to put it together on the fly. And whenever you're trying to put it together on the fly, you're going to have all sorts of tensions around money. That's across the board. But when you have these distinctions between online and grassroots and everything else, it's going to collapse in acrimony, and that seems to be what we're seeing.
I also think it shows how easy it is for kind of celebrity culture, or just like this is a cool thing, to that kind of ethos to invade an activist movement and just have it be about handbags and commercials. And
right, because that's
for it to become capitalistic in a way.
Right, that's the society we are now, because there isn't a kind of democratic venue for it to play out in. You can't, the energy that formed around it had nowhere to go, because the system is set up to block police reform from going through Congress, for instance, to block in the 1960s, you had a civil rights movement that was then channeled through Congress and created Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, housing in 1968. This time there was no response. Everything was shut down. So the energy is going to go somewhere else, and it goes into documentaries and speaking gigs and books.
But we don't. I don't want to
culture.
deny personal responsibility either, though. We don't know. There are serious questions to be asked of the people who founded and were running the organization up until now.
Sure.
Well, our rising panel is next, so we hope you stay with us for that.